Hello everyone, welcome today to Virtual World's Real Body. I'm Kelton. Today we will be having a lecture on urban memory and archi-virtual heritage. Notice that the name archi-virtual is a coined word. You may say it's a new word. We think of architectural space as very special relationship with virtual reality because after all, a virtual reality or a virtual world is to emulate or simulate spatial experience within the virtual realm. And therefore, the real reality experience of physical space is closely related to the virtual reality experience. Here we talk about architecture and the notion of an archi-virtual heritage. Archi-virtual means the virtualization of architecture as it's become the collective experience of people in the city. So as you may say, space is the common ground between architecture and virtual reality. We talk about space not of outer space, but as spatial experience. And therefore, in virtual reality, not only we experience the space with our body and our sense, it's also a spatial perception that is being created in virtual reality. Here, we would like to use this lecture to talk about the special relation and the synergy between physical architectural space and virtual reality space. We will also talk about something that we call virtual architecture. When more and more virtual worlds and virtual space are created for experience, there is a need to organize and to conceptualize what kind of space we will be experiencing in the virtual reality area. And therefore, virtual architecture will spring up as a kind of new kind of spatial arrangement or design. Again, we'll talk about the virtual and the virtual place. And with virtual place, we come up with ideas of imaginary places. We call those imaginaries. In imaginary places, we also will have a certain experience for the user. And as more and more experience is accumulated in virtual reality, these kind of experience will be merged with the physical spatial experience of our physical world. And as memory is being created and collective memory is being generated from these virtual space, they will become more and more important as more and more people share these experiences. For example, when we talk about imaginaries, we think of a place that we imagined what it is like before we go there. We have some idea in our mind what the place would be like, such as a city like Paris or New York. Already in media or in images or in cinema or films or movies, we've seen the place before, even though we haven't visited. But in some way, we get some idea of what the place is like. Therefore, the place resides in our imagination. We already have a preconceived notion of what the place it is, what kind of flavor, what kind of characteristic the place has. Anything that relates to French or the French culture, it's also very much part of the imaginary of the city of Paris. And so, this kind of spatial imaginary comprise of a lot of different sensory experience and sensory memories. You can say that it's encapsulate a whole experience of what people think of a certain place or imagine a certain place would be. If you go to Paris or the city of Paris, it's also related to the imagination of it, because in so many films and ideas, literature, or even stories, it has a certain description of the city. Those will be combined into the real existing city, and it all become part of an imaginary. In France, the culture composed of philosophies, of the food, of fashions, all these we can think of, are part of this whole encapsulated experience that we can call French culture. And when we think of the city, it's very much related to this part of the imagination. Of course, history and its revolution is also part of it. And therefore, the city itself is not just the physical surroundings, but the imagination of it. You may say there is a virtual Paris in everybody's mind. When people talk about Paris, they have something in their mind of what the city is like. And each person will have a different imagination of the city. As you can see, in history, all these imaginations and record of photographics, explorations, artistic creations, all kinds of culture that is generated from the city plays a part in that imagination. Here we will use the term imaginary as a kind of way to think about this combination of the physical place and the imagination of it. So besides imaginary, we will talk about the place in stories, imaginary ideas in stories. These are very important in terms of generating what kind of virtual worlds or the possibilities of virtual worlds. On the other hand, there is a possibilities for people to travel virtually so that they don't need to actually go out any other place to touch the physical world. They can all use their imagination. This is very much the stuff of the science fiction where people dream or use technology to be someplace else, to travel or traverse a long distance to places that is not being explored, or adventures to things that are unknown. You may say there are uncharted water in the physical world, but also there are uncharted water in the imaginary world also. And this universe is as large as the imagination can be. Here we will be showing a film called The Bounty. And here we will illustrate what kind of imaginary is talking about. In the story of the Bounty, which actually took place in history before, the crews of the Bounty become the subject of the dramatic story that happened on the ship. On the other hand, this journey of the crew is very much related to this location of the South Sea. The story embedded into this incredible backdrop of the South Pacific. It conjures up all kinds of imaginations and fantasies about this kind of South Sea paradise in the minds of people who mostly live in cities and urbanized area. These places are far away and becomes a kind of paradisic imaginary in the minds of people. On the other hand, because the actual history, actual event did take place, it got mixed up with the imagination of people, and the story becomes some form of legends or myth. especially when it's being reproduced in Hollywood spectacular drama. These kind of things become embedded into a further imagination of people. Here, the star of the film Mutiny on the Bounty, Marlon Brando, also purchases a real South Sea island, a South Sea paradise, during the filming because he loved the place so much. This kind of event being embedded into the real and the imaginary makes up a whole of a cultural heritage that people relate to. And therefore, there are cultural imaginary and iconic ideas that people can share between movies, real historical events, and also their own imaginations. These things mix up of the exotics, myths, and something called the sublime or the romantic in our culture, where real place mixed with imaginary place, real event mixed with imaginary characters. The imaginary can be conjured up in paintings also, and in all kinds of the creative arts, such as literature or cinema. Very much, these things are related and make reference or homage to each other. In a way, it kind of adds up to the richness of the imagination. Here, I would like to talk about computing and architecture, because with this kind of combination of the development of technology and the discipline, we are edging closer and closer to a certain experience that is provided by virtual reality. In virtual reality, when we create virtual worlds, when the experience is seamless and engaging, this kind of experience can be compared to real-world experience. And more, people will devote more time into the virtual experience. And eventually, the experience in the real world and the physical world will get mixed up with this kind of imaginary or virtual experience in virtual space. In the development of computing and architecture, recently, during these last 10 years, there has been an advance in development of the photorealistic rendering. In the development of the computing and architecture during these last few years, there has been an advanced development of photorealistic rendering, where architectural images can be rendered in the computer for photorealistic effect. At the same time, just these few years, real-time photorealistic rendering is being developed so that the real-time photo real image or even animations can be generated. As you can see, images from the computer can recreate a photorealistic situation where lighting, texture, environmental effects are all combined together to become a photograph that is not existing in real life. This photograph generates a virtual world that is completely virtual, and yet it looks photorealistic. These are being used in special effects in cinema and movies. On the other hand, these kind of photorealistic images can contribute to a certain simulation of the virtual reality experience, as more fidelity of the images being created in virtual reality, it's becoming more and more real and realistic. we call this a simulation of the real world. Simulation and the experience of simulation has always been in human development, historical development of all these panoramic simulations and dramas, panorama, has been an attempt to recreate a certain space for people to speculate, for people to experience. With the development of VR, the immersive VR experience will become the continuing tradition of this desire to experience another place or another time in a very realistic way. Here we can see that the VR generation or replication of the Barcelona Pavilion cannot be distinguished from the photographs of the real place. It's almost the same and very seamlessly merged with the real experience. In effect, we can experience the real place almost going to the same place without going outside of our virtual reality room. On the other hand, virtual reality is not bound by the physical limitation of architecture. Architecture is bound by gravity, material, and the physical limits of structure. Also, it takes a lot of labor to construct a building. However, in virtual reality, everything can be recreated within the virtual world without regards to physical limitation or gravity or physics. In effect, a lot of imaginary place or fantastic place can be created in the virtual world that defines dimensions or scale, defines gravities and limitations. When we think about the virtual world being generated in games, such as the famous Grand Theft Auto, the place called the Los Santos is actually a mimic of the real Los Angeles city. And yet, the way it's copying Los Angeles is to draw the essence of what is Los Angeles and what is the American West Coast lifestyle as a form of imaginary for people to play in the game, to constantly imagine themselves being in Los Angeles and living the lifestyle of Los Angeles. However, this particular Los Angeles that we call Los Santos in Grand Theft Auto can manifest itself in many ways, either in an exact replica or with just the number of landmarks that resembles Los Angeles. And therefore, the virtual worlds or the copies of the real world can be of many forms and many variations. One of the fun and one of the thrill of being in a large game such as Grand Theft Auto is the illusion of freedom in such a big world. We call these open world games because the player not only need to follow the plot or the motivation to achieve a certain goals. They can roam around in an open way in the open world cities to look at things, to engage in other kinds of activities besides just following the main narrative of the game. And so we think of the game world as part of this virtual world creation that is very much linked to the real world, the real architectural space or architectural experience of the cities or real world that we have experienced. As you can see, the linkage is so intimate and very much a part of the experience of virtual reality if we completely create a virtual world that is disconnect from reality, we will feel that the alienation and also the abstract unknown of this virtual world. And yet, if virtual worlds are based upon a known reality or experience of people in the real world, then the kind of engagement we create in virtual worlds can be very immense and very, very rewarding.